Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Are you sitting comfortably? Well, so am I. I feel very much at home in this ancient amphitheater. So, friends, Romans, and countrymen, we are here to engage in what is the essential spirit of the university. I find it a thrill that institutions like this still exist, which put on public lectures from different perspectives in order to feed the minds of students and to introduce them to basic ideas from which they will select as they form their own adult worldview. And so it is a particular honor to be invited now for a second time to be in this distinguished university. Third time, apparently, but then I am a mathematician and so I can't count. So if we can get the slides going behind me, we shall start with our question. Do science and God mix? That's the first question. But there's going to be a second question. And it's this. Do science and atheism mix? And I'm going to suggest that the answer to the first question is yes. And the answer to the second question is no. Now, I got into this because having been brought up in a small country, Northern Ireland, that was riven, sadly, by sectarian violence, but having parents who were not sectarian, though Christian, and who gave me the greatest gift a parent can give a child, they allowed me to think. I ended up in Cambridge, in England. And one of the things that has focused my life, and there have been many, but one of the things that principally did that was that sitting at a meal in my first couple of weeks at Cambridge, someone asked me, did I believe in God? And then they suddenly said, oh, sorry, you're Irish. I really shouldn't have asked you that question because you Irish all believe in God and you fight about it. I'd heard it many times, but I saw my opportunity in Cambridge to really get to know people from different worldviews. And I started that day, and I've been doing it for the 50 years and more since then. Searching for truth. Because, you see, there was a risk. My parents Christian, my grandparents Christian, my great-grandparents Christian. So it's obviously Irish genetics and DNA. And how would you answer that? And the only way I could manage to come up with was get to find out why other people think what they think. And put it alongside what you think. And try to be open and honest and fair. And it's thrilling to do that in a university because, after all, when you look at the history of culture, the great universities, first in Europe and then elsewhere, were all theological foundations. They met to discuss intellectually the whole question of God and the universe. Far from thinking that rational thought, intellectual activity, science, and the humanities were against God. They thought the exact opposite. And so Oxford still today has the motto, Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my illumination. So let's look at this because the only reason we're asking the question is that the dominant philosophy, the dominant worldview in much of the academy, very much in my country and elsewhere, is materialism or naturalism. The idea that there is no God and there is no transcendence. And often the suggestion is made that you have to choose between education, scientific or of any other kind, and faith in God. The late Stephen Hawking put that very forcefully. You've got to choose between science and God. I met that in a very powerful form very early on at the age of 19 at Cambridge, when a Nobel Prize winner invited me to his room after a brief discussion at dinner. And he had 2 or 3 other professors with him, and he sat me down and he said, "Lennox, do you want to make a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Well," he said, "this is what you've got to do. Tonight, in front of witnesses, give up these naive ideas of God, because they'll only cripple you. You lose ground in front of your peers, you'll never make it." It was an amazing example of pressure, and I remember thinking that if I'd been an atheist and he'd been a Christian, he would have lost his job the next day. It was enormous pressure. And I looked at him and I said, "Sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I've got already?" And he came out with some philosophy of Bergson, which, thanks to my reading of C.S. Lewis, I knew about. So I said, "Sir, if that's all you've got to offer me, I prefer to stay with what I've got and I'll take the risk." But what that did to me, ladies and gentlemen, was put into my mind and heart a resolve that if ever I got into academia, I would foster the exact opposite of that attitude. In other words, I would want to go to people respectfully and share with them what I had found and what made sense to me, and allow them, without any pressure from me, to make up their own minds. So that's enough of my background to explain to you exactly where I'm coming from. So let's have a look at this topic, because the widespread view is that you've got science on the one side and God on the other, and never the two will mix. But that just cannot be true, for the simple reason that we can establish it in just a minute, which I'm now about to do. Let's go again to the top of science, the Nobel Prize for Physics. And on the left, you see Peter Higgs, he of the Higgs boson, a brilliant scientist who won the Nobel Prize not long ago. To the right is someone you may not recognize, but he's there because he's an Irishman. He's the only Irish Nobel Prize winner, E.T.S. Walton. And the interesting thing is that he worked with Rutherford to split the atom, and he won the Nobel Prize for it. So there are 2 Nobel Prize winners. What's the difference between them? Well, not their physics. They're both brilliant. But Higgs is an atheist, and Walton was a Christian. Now, that is enough to show that science and faith in God are not incompatible. Indeed, when I was confronted by the Nobel Prize winner, I wish I knew then, but then I was very young. I didn't know very much. I don't know much more now, but now I know that in the 100 years before this particular Nobel Prize winner lived, over 60% of Nobel Prize winners believed in God. That might be a statistic that surprises some of you. So there's no embarrassment here, but it tells us where the problem really lies. The difference between the 2 men, I repeat, is not in their scientific capacity. It's in their worldview. One an atheist, the other a Christian. That is where the conflict lies, and it changes the real question. The real question is, where does science fit in the big picture of worldview? Does it lead, as Richard Dawkins argues, to naturalism? Or does it lead to theism? Or does it lead nowhere? And one of the world's most distinguished philosophers is Alvin Plantinga. And he says the alleged conflict between science and theism is superficial. There is real concord. whereas the alleged concord between science and atheism is superficial. There is real conflict. And yet, the conflict that is alleged is very popular indeed. So the first question I'm going to ask about it is a general cultural question. What is driving it? And the first thing that's driving it is what we call scientism. The notion espoused by Dawkins, by Peter Atkins, by Stephen Hawking, that science is the only way to truth. And Alex Rosenberg is a distinguished philosopher whom I debated at Princeton, and he says being scientific just means treating science as our exclusive guide to reality, to nature, both our own nature and everything else. And Bertrand Russell once put the view like this, although he didn't quite believe it himself. What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Well, I hope you like logic, even this late at night, because Bertrand Russell, bright though he was, lost his grip on logic when he said that. What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Is that a statement of science? No, it isn't. So if it's true, it's false. So it's logically incoherent. It's like the postmodern relativist who sits in front of you and solemnly says there's no such thing as absolute truth, and expects you to believe that what he's just said is absolute truth. That view leads to physical reductionism, as expressed here by Dawkins, explaining everything in terms of the simple things that physicists can either understand or are working on. I haven't met many high-powered physicists that tell me that what they're working on is simple, but we leave this. Because physical reductionism leads inevitably to psychological reductionism. Francis Crick, your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are, in fact, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. That is what he calls his astonishing hypothesis. He changes gear in the middle of the book and contradicts the hypothesis by saying you are largely the behavior of a vast assembly, and so the thing dissolves. But you can see that here are scientists taking this scientific approach to the world and drawing conclusions about the nature not only of the physical universe, but of the human universe. Ideas have consequences. Well, that's the scientific direction, but let's go to another Nobel Prize winner, Erwin Schrödinger, and he says this: I am very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives a lot of factual information, puts all our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart, that really matters to us. Science cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. It sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. Now, what he is saying there is immensely important for the current debate. It's that science doesn't tell us everything. And science is not coextensive with rationality. I'll come to the second point in a moment. And Dawkins and I have very little in common, but one of the things we have in common is an admiration for another Nobel Prize winner, Sir Peter Medawar, who wrote a fascinating book that every scientist should read called The Limits of Science, or Advice to a Young Scientist, something like that. And he says that the existence of a limit to science is, however, made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. Questions that kids ask, such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? Now, Medawar recognized that the natural sciences cannot, almost by definition, deal with these fundamental philosophical questions. And hence my interest rose when Stephen Hawking published a book called The Grand Design with co-author Leonard Mlodinow, physics of Star Wars man. So he asks some of these questions, Medawar's questions, and here's what he says about them. Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Notice the last two lines, that's scientism. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery. There's nobody else. Well, that wipes out at least half the faculties of this university straight away. And look at the first bit. Philosophy is dead. Well, you can imagine the reaction of the Department of Philosophy at Cambridge. They weren't exactly thrilled. But the irony is, this occurs at the beginning of the book. And what's the rest of it about? The philosophy of science. And Hawking proves conclusively that he has no idea about philosophy. And it's very interesting that Sir Martin Rees, the astronomer royal who was a close friend of Stephen Hawking and admired him greatly, and Hawking was a genius. I remember him at Cambridge. He was just ahead of me, but he was light years ahead of me in his mathematical ability. But even in his obituary, Martin Rees was fair enough to say that when Hawking ventured into philosophy, he didn't know what he was talking about, and we should not listen to him. Philosophy is dead. Einstein once said, and it's a warning, the scientist is a poor philosopher. So here is Hawking, and I thought he's going to answer these big questions. He's going to give us an insight into his philosophy. He says philosophy is dead, and then he talks about the philosophy of science. And I was utterly intrigued and decided I am going to look into this to try to discover what is behind it. Because this is the book in which Hawking rejects the notion of God. Well, now, let's just have one or two simple preliminaries that will help clear the ground. The first one is a statement by probably the most brilliant physicist of the 20th century, Richard Feynman. I believe he said that a scientist looking at problems outside of their field is just as dumb as the next guy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is extremely important, and it applies to me, because everything I've said so far is outside my field. And therefore, I am likely to be just as dumb as the next guy. We all do this. So what are we going to do about it? Well, what we do about it is this. We take the experts in the field we're wandering into seriously and find out what they say. We don't content ourselves with knocking down people who've no idea of their subject. And so with that warning to myself, I then go on to the next point, which has helped me enormously in life. Statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. When Hawking's appeared on the newspapers in Britain saying there is no God, many young people reacted, and in fact, I got a letter from one of them. He'd been driving through the streets of my home country in Belfast, and he noticed this big hoarding. Hawking says there's no God. And he said, I was driving the car and I started to shake and I had to stop and get out. And I said to myself, if Stephen Hawking says there's no God, who am I to say there is? That's why I wrote my little book, God and Stephen Hawking, to help people like that. This is a scientist, but he's not making a statement of science. But because he is a brilliant scientist, his statement is given the same authority as if he were talking about general relativity or black holes or something like this. So we need to remember that. And then the third thing that often stops the discussion dead is the subject of the God delusion. The God Delusion, as you know, is a book by Richard Dawkins. And it suggests that our ideas of God are delusional. And he says a delusion is a fixed idea, fixed false idea that is held tenaciously against strong contrary evidence. Well, that's a very fair definition, and it holds in psychiatry, although Dawkins says he doesn't want to go quite down that route. But you see, Dawkins is making a statement that belongs to the psychiatric or psychological field, outside his own discipline. I'm not a psychiatrist either. So when I read this, I thought, well, why don't I check and see what psychiatrists think? So I went straight to the top, the president of the Royal College of Psychiatry, Professor Andrew Sims, past president. And there I discovered, does he believe that God is a delusion? Absolutely not. And in fact, he says, one of the best kept secrets of psychiatric research is the positive correlation between belief in God and well-being. And he goes through all kinds of detailed examples of this: less aggression, less tendency on narcotic dependence, less tendency to suicide, much more happiness in relationships, etc., etc., etc. And he ends up saying this: if the result of many meta-studies, that is, studies of studies, were known, but it isn't. If the research had proved the opposite, that belief in God damages your health, it would have been front page news on every newspaper in the world. That's what a psychiatrist thinks. And in fact, this book has lost Dawkins' immense credibility with many atheists who work in these fields. They say his research doesn't exist because he didn't know about these studies. Now that concerns me, because to write a book for the general public that is actually factually incorrect and demonstrably incorrect is not serious scientific thinking. But it has had a massive effect in reviving the old Freudian argument. And it's amazing how often you meet the Freudian argument. I was doing a debate in the Netherlands, and it was a professor of physics that was put up against me, and he suddenly said to this huge audience, like this one, he said, "Your God is like Santa Claus." And I thought I would test that out of the audience, you see. So I said, well, let's test that. He said, how can we test it? I said, very easily. So I said to the audience, tell me, how many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as adults? Not a hand went up. Then I said, tell me, how many of you came to believe in God as adults? And hundreds of hands went up. And I turned to him and I said, please, I said, with all respect, don't insult our intelligence. Some of the best minds in the world have for centuries been thinking about the question of God. They have not been thinking about Santa Claus. It is foolishness, this kind of argument, and it needs to be called exactly what it is. Freud's idea, of course, was that we project an image into the sky of our idealized father figure, and that is what religion is. But you know, it's a double-edged sword. There's a brilliant psychiatrist in Germany, Manfred Lutz, and he's written a book called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the Great One, meaning God. It's very witty. But he says, if there is no God, then the Freudian argument is brilliant as an argument against religion. Religion is a projection of an infantile desire for a father figure. If there is no God, that works. But he said, of course, if there is a God, the very same argument shows you that atheism is an infantile delusion. The protection of our wish for there to be no God, so that we never have to interact with him, in particular about the question of the mess we've made of life. As Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel Prize winner for literature in Poland, said, atheism is the great opium of the people. The desire not ever to have to face what we've done in any kind of final judgment. So it works both ways. And Manfred Lutz says the bottom line is Freud, Frankl, Jung, and all the rest of them, they do not even touch the question as to whether there is a God or not. We have to look elsewhere. But you sometimes have some fun with this, you know, because Hawking, and you may have heard me say this before, but Hawking was asked about what he thought. He said religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And the newspaper asked me for a comment, and I said, well, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now, the fact that you clapped shows you weren't listening, because I said the Freudian argument proves nothing. You see, but it is nice of you to clap, and that, of course, is very good. So now let's get down to the question that this raises. How do we decide what kind of evidence? And there are three main sources. There is the history of science, the nature and philosophy of science, and the results of science. And the very interesting thing is that when it comes to history, the rise of science in the 16th and 17th centuries was intimately connected with the Christian faith. Men became scientific, said Lewis, because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. A very eminent ancient historian, Edwin Judge in Australia, says that Christianity, or above all the biblical doctrine of creation, is itself the creator of the methodology of modern science. The book of creation, which was read to us at the beginning, is the origin of modern science, the book of Genesis. Let me put it this way. I am not remotely ashamed of being a Christian and a scientist. Why? Well, in the first place, it was Christianity gave me my subject. And you can trace that. Galileo, God is known by nature in his works, and by doctrine it is revealed word. Kepler, much loved by mathematicians, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God, and which is revealed to us in the language of mathematics. Isaac Newton, don't doubt the Creator, because it's inconceivable that accidents alone could be the controller of this universe. James Clerk Maxwell, the Scottish Einstein, inscribed on the door of the most famous physics lab in the world, where it is still today, in Latin and in English, great are the works of the Lord to be studied by all who take delight in them. Now, it's easy to see what the connection is. Why would people want to do science? Because they believed that there was an intelligent cause behind the universe. And therefore, part of their worship of God, loving the Lord their God with their mind, it's the first commandment, would be at least in part seen by their being intrigued in working out how this great creation worked. And so we owe modern science, and this is a generally held thesis. It has to be nuanced, of course, and there's a massive literature on it. But generally it is held that there's a very close connection between biblical theism and the rise of science. Not only that, a very eminent historian of science who was Oxford's second professor of science and religion, Peter Harrison of Australia, has written a fascinating book about the influence of the reformers' attitude to the study of Scripture to the rise of science. And he points out it was taking Scripture seriously and not taking it allegorically or metaphorically, but seeing what the text actually was talking about, that led to a revolution in attitude to Scripture. And he said that actually was a critical thing in the rise of science. So it's a huge legacy. It wasn't atheism that was behind this. It was the Christian faith. So we have all these great luminaries, and Newton held the Lucasian chair in Cambridge, and so did Stephen Hawking. And here's the Times article that I referred to. And I'm going to focus the problem for ease of exposition this way. Isaac Newton discovered the law of gravity, and he believed in God. Stephen Hawking, same chair at Cambridge, uses gravity as a reason not to believe in God. And that will help us, I think, gain insight into the contemporary discussion. Here's the question. How do we get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism? And I want to argue that there are three reasons. False logic, false ideas about the nature of God, and false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. So let's have a go at the false logic. Here is the central argument of the book, The Grand Design. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When I first read that, I thought, pardon? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction. Worse still, because there is a law of gravity, not because gravity exists. But this is a profound philosophical mistake. What would a law of gravity mean if gravity didn't exist? And behind this is the very strangely widespread idea that you constantly come across that laws are creative. Now, status of scientific law is very important, and I'll say little bits and pieces about it, but let's just look at this. After a debate, not with me, Peter Atkins, the famous physical chemist who's written most of the books that are in your library here in Oxford, and a notorious atheist, I had a chance to chat to him, and I said, Peter, tell me what created the universe. Oh, he said, mathematics. And I'm afraid I was taken by surprise, and I was very rude, and I laughed. And he said, why are you laughing? Well, I said, Peter, I'm really sorry, but that must be the silliest thing I've heard for a long time. He said, why? Well, I said, Peter, let me put it simply. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put £2 in your pocket? You see, this is a profound mistake. That doing mathematics creates something. It is actually part of the mistake that lay behind the world banking crisis. There were a lot of brilliant mathematicians who thought that doing maths can create money. Some people call it creative accounting. Lewis saw this years ago, and he wrote brilliantly about it in his book on miracles. He said, you can do arithmetic for here to eternity, adding 1 + 1 + 1. But if you don't get £1 and £1, you'll never have £2. Mathematics will never do it for you. Think of Newton's laws of motion. Did they ever move a billiard ball in the history of the universe? No. People with cues move the billiard balls. Newton's laws describe the motion. They don't cause it. It's a huge mistake to think that laws are causative or even creative. But it's worse still, you see, this sentence. The universe will create itself. Now, what do you think that means? If X creates Y, that sort of means if you've got X, you'll get Y in some fashion. So if I say X creates X, what does that mean? If you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it seems to me to mean that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. And then comes the last thing. From nothing. Do you know nothing is fascinating these days? I go round giving lectures about nothing. And I'm tempted to give you one, but I'm not going to give you one. I'm simply going to quote Lawrence Krauss, astrophysicist from ASU, a very strong atheist. And here's in his book, at the beginning, A Universe from Nothing. And here we go. Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. What? What would you say to a 13-year-old that wrote that? That is nonsense. Now, nothing is very interesting. Because you see, my friends in astrophysics, they have a problem that was explained to us very briefly at the beginning in the reading from Genesis. Astrophysics leads us back to a singularity, a universe from nothing. And people are very aware that nothing comes from nothing. So they have a real problem. What do we do? And the answer these days is you redefine nothing, which is very difficult to do. And I had a wonderful opportunity at the Harvard MIT Faculty Club where I was asked, it was honestly, when I look back, the nerve I had to actually say I'd do it, to have a public discussion with Alan Guth, the father of inflation, one of the most famous, if not the most famous cosmologists in the world today. So we had this very friendly debate. And I asked the first question. I said, Alan, the public out there are very puzzled about nothing. I said, tell me, when you as an astrophysicist use the word nothing to describe some kind of original state of the universe, do you mean it in the usual philosophical sense, absence of anything? He said, no, we do not. I said, thank you very much. You see, read Hawking's book, What is Nothing? A Quantum Vacuum. Read Krauss's book, Nothing is Pregnant with All Kinds of Possibilities. I mean, it goes on and on. The point is, they have not solved their problem. They haven't got a universe from nothing. And why haven't they? Because the universe does come from nothing physical, but it doesn't come from nothing. In the beginning, did you hear it read? God created the heavens and the earth. The universe doesn't come from nothing. It comes from God, who's not nothing, but he's not physical. God is spirit. The primary stuff in the universe is not mass energy. It is actually spirit. So that, I think, shows you that many of these people are depending on a thoroughly multiply leveled false logic that I find simply astonishing. Secondly, false ideas about God. I couldn't understand why Hawking said you must choose between science and God until I realized he's not talking about the God of the Bible at all. He's talking about an ancient Greek type of God, like the God of lightning, who's postulated to account for something that science has not yet accounted for. The God of lightning can be dealt with in an elementary lecture on atmospheric physics. It's a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it, that kind of thing. Now, here's the point. And when I saw this, I began to understand. If you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then of course you have to choose between God and science as a matter of definition. If you define God that way, and suddenly I realized that many of these people are doing exactly that. I wonder if you heard the argument that was put to me in a debate that you can see online in the Oxford Union by the editor of Skeptic magazine, Michael Shermer. And he looked at me and pointed at me and said, "You are an atheist with respect to Zeus and Baal and Astarte," and he went through a long list. And then he grinned and came to his punchline, and he said, "We just go one God more." Now, I admit I am an Zeusist and an Baalist. I am an atheist with respect to all these gods. But when he said, "We just go one God more," he let the cat out of the bag, because it shows that he's fallen in with Hawking's idea, which is explicit in his book, that all these gods are the same. And the God of the Bible is like the gods of the ancient Near East. But then they don't study what experts in the ancient Near East say. And one of the world's leaders in that field is Werner Jaeger. And he's written a definitive book which is fascinating. And he says the supreme difference between all the ancient gods and the God of the Bible is very simple to explain. all the gods of the ancient Near East descended from the universe. That is, they were products of the original chaotic material form of the universe. The God of the Bible created the universe. And you see, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. You may have noticed that when Genesis 1 was read to us, it did not say, in the beginning God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. He created the whole show, not just the bits we don't understand. And indeed, it's the bits we do understand that usually lead those of us who are interested in science to increase our faith in God. Isaac Newton, when he discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, I've got a law, I don't need God. No. He said, what a marvelous God who did it that way. So now we come to number 3. What is scientific explanation? Because often we're told we don't need God because science explains. What does the law of gravity explain? I was taught at school that it explained gravity. I was an adult before I realized that not even Newton thought it explained gravity. It doesn't explain gravity. It gives us a brilliant mathematical way to calculate the effects of gravitation. But no one, as far as I understand from Nobel Prize-winning physicists, no one yet knows what gravity is. So laws of science are normally, even within science, limited explanations. And Ludwig Wittgenstein got it right when he said the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. They describe the universe, they describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. And we can see this easily with a simple example. Why is the water boiling? Well, because of heat conducted through the bottom of a kettle agitating the molecules of water. Well, yes, but it's actually boiling because I would love a cup of tea. And I mean that. And you laugh, and of course you laugh correctly. But can you see that those are two different explanations of the same phenomenon? They don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement. And interestingly enough, it's the personal explanation that's more interesting. People have been drinking tea for thousands of years before they knew anything about heat equations. Why cannot some of our leading thinkers see that? That explanation is a multi-leveled thing. And so we can apply that at a higher level. And I can say this, surely Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation of the motor car. It's dead easy. I find kids at school can get it immediately. But leading scientists know only one kind of explanation is valid, the scientific one. It's sheer nonsense. But now there's one very important thing about explanation. Using God as an explanation is absurd, says Dawkins in The God Delusion, since God is by definition more complex than the thing you are explaining. That sounds wonderful until you apply it to Dawkins' own book at which it stands. So I read this book, The God Delusion. It's quite complex, about 400 pages, and I ask someone, what is its origin? And they say, well, actually, it originates in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. Well, I say that's impossible because he doesn't believe an explanation can be more complex than the thing you're explaining. You see, it doesn't work. There is one area of interest to all of us where simple to complex explanation, which often works in science and is wonderful when it does, simply doesn't work. And that's in the area where language is involved. The moment you see written language, as you see behind you, you know that added to all the natural processes, etc., that are involved, there's a mind behind that, because language proceeds from a mind. And it's so interesting. We'll see that from a simple word. And I often say to scientists, tell me about the longest word you've ever discovered, DNA, 3.5 billion letters long. And they, without blinking, they say chance and necessity. Chance and the laws of nature. I said, you don't say that about the words up here, just behind you. There's something odd going on here. And I want to conclude, I'm going to miss a little bit out here, and I'm going to say that I want to just come to why I believe that atheism and science don't mix. Let's think about mathematics and the mind. Great thinkers like Albert Einstein. And Einstein was very clear that science has got what he called a religious dimension. And he says to the scientific endeavor there belongs the faith. Please notice that. All scientists are people of faith, by the way. Not in God necessarily, but they believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. And he says, I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith. So please, ladies and gentlemen, forget this false dichotomy between science and faith. It is completely absurd. Every one of us is a person of faith. We believe certain things in order to do our intellectual disciplines. You didn't conduct all the experiments in your physics textbook, did you? You believe that the results are true. You believe that science is worth doing or literature is worth studying. Now, what I want to investigate is this. What is the basis for that faith that we all need to pursue an academic subject? I ask people what they do science with. And, of course, leading scientists often tell me with glee about the billion-dollar experiment they have set up on the far side of the planet Mars or something like this. And I said, no. I don't mean that. What do you do science with? Oh, they say. You mean our, and they're about to say mind, when they remember it's not politically correct to say mind. They say, you mean my brain. Well, okay, I think there's a difference between brain and mind, and I've written about it. But let it stand. You do it with your brain, yes. Well, tell me the story of your brain. It's often great fun listening to the brief history of the brain from some of my colleagues and friends. And it boils down often to this. Well, the short story about the brain is very simple. The brain is an end product of an unguided natural process. And I smile at them and I say, and you trust it. Now tell me honestly, if you knew your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you use it? I've never had the answer yes to that question. Never. And people get stuck. Said, why then do you trust your mind to do science, if that's what you believe about it? And often they look at me and they say I'm not bright enough to think of arguments like that, which is perfectly true. So they say, where did you get that argument? I said, I might surprise you. I got it from Charles Darwin, who wrote, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. That was Darwin. Response much more recently by Plantinga. If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, brief history of the brain, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own atheism. Now, Plantinga is a brilliant Christian philosopher. That doesn't, by the way, falsify his arguments. But Thomas Nagel is an atheist philosopher. And he wrote a book with an explosive subtitle. Just look at it. Why the Neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. And if you want fun, look up on the internet to see the reaction to what Nagel wrote. But here is Nagel seeing the problem that C.S. Lewis saw, that Plantinga saw, that Darwin saw. if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot, obviously cannot, be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. And Lewis got it right years ago. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. If ultimate reality is not material, not to take this into account in our context is to neglect the most important fact of all. Yet the supernatural dimension has not only been forgotten, it has been ruled out of court by many. The naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. The moment one attends to this, it is obvious. Just listen to this, because this has huge implications for each one of us. It is obvious that one's own thinking cannot be merely a natural event, and therefore something other than nature exists. If you want evidence of the supernatural, you start with the human mind. So, my conclusion. Cosmic chemistry, do science and God mix? Very well. But science and atheism do not mix well, because atheism logically leads to doubt about the validity of the rational processes needed to do science, or indeed anything else. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when I compare the two worldviews, one starts with nothing, the other starts with God. Has the irony of that struck you? That we have reached, for the first time in history, the stage where the choice is between God and nothing. What makes more sense? The nothing explanation that somehow produces everything? Or the God explanation that tells you that God is primary and mass energy is derivative? In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. It's an existence statement. The Word is eternal. The Word has always been. The universe hasn't always been. It came to be. How did it come to be? It came to be through the Word. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. That's step one. Step two is much bigger. Because if that is true, ladies and gentlemen, then it adds plausibility and credibility to the next step, which is the central claim of Christianity, that the Word became human. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, and to as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become what they were not before, sons of God, even to those who believed on his name. But that bigger story is for another time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful and very significant discussion tonight. I'm sure our wonderful audience will remember this evening as one of those bright stars in their memory, that we listened to a person of your stature, but also the modest and loving way in which you have brought this to us tonight. I think we remember that we sat at the fountain of wisdom and knowledge, in the right sense of the word. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are doing well with time. We are proceeding. We are going to ask our panelists. They have prepared their questions. They are going to present their questions here at the podium. Professor Lennox will take first three, then two. Then we'll just look at the time and the progression of time, and we'll switch over to the audience. So can those who arranged for this please just come to the podium and ask the first questions?
Yes, fine.
All right. Good evening, Professor. My name is Mario. Also, good evening to everyone at large. My question is, or rather a statement, nature demonstrates numerous instances of blind, merciless indifference, as your colleague Richard Dawkins puts
I
it,
can't hear
Prof.
a word he's saying.
Now,
You tell me.
all right. I state that nature demonstrates numerous instances of blind, merciless indifference, as your colleague Richard Dawkins puts it. Now, Prof, how do you reconcile, for instance, extreme cruelty that occurs all around us in nature with your belief in an all-good and almighty God?
Now take the question.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I've got it. Oh, very good. Okay.
This is going to work very well. Thank you. Can we have the second question and the third already, please?
Yeah. Good evening. My name is Unaysa Latif. In Islam, it is stated in the Quran, chapter 41, verse 53, "We will show them our signs in the universe and in their own selves until it becomes manifest to them that this, the Quran, is the truth." This verse clearly indicates that science is one of the many aspects which is used as a channel to prove Allah, which is known as God in English, His truth, and the relationship between the Creator and the creation. Professor, do you view science and religion as two separate aspects or as one as a whole? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Got it, yes. Give me your... Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. That was clear. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and Prof. Okay. I am a pagan. Can you say that science is there to show us how we were made through the divine? Can I repeat the question?
Yes, do.
Can you say that science is there to show us how we were made through the divine?
Through the divine.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks. Professor Lennox, shall we take those three or two more? You happy to take these?
Okay. Oh, yes. Right. Thank you very much, folks, for your thoughtful questions. Now, this is a Q&A. Now, that's a very unsatisfactory process because you're about to plumb the depths of my ignorance. You see, a Q&A, by definition, is an immediate response to questions that people have been thinking about, sometimes for weeks. And all I can do is respond off the top of my head how I would begin to think about these questions. But that's okay, because if these are serious questions that you are asking, the more important thing is the work you do when you go home to work on this until you get a satisfactory answer. So let's have a look at the questions. We'll take the second one first. Are science and religion separate, or are they one and the same thing? And the speaker quoted the Quran. And it's very important for us to realize that during the Middle Ages, the Islamic House of Wisdom in Baghdad was one of the great transmitters of ancient Greek science and brought it and preserved it to the West. And we owe them a great debt for doing that. Now, the question is, are science and religion separate? Well, religion, of course, covers many different things. You can, if you like, ascribe Christianity as a religion. I don't think of it, first of all, as that, because for me, the primary thing is not religion in the sense of buildings and ritual. It's a personal relationship with God. But let it stand. But let it stand for the moment. Because thinking of it intellectually as disciplines, the natural sciences are separate from, and let me stick to the biblical revelation. That ought to be obvious. I have never ever taught algebra or calculus from Leviticus. Now, or even numbers. You've got some really clever professors here, you know. But, now here's the mistake people make. Religious texts, including the Bible, are not textbooks of science. However, they do have something very important to tell us about the physical universe. The words that were read at the beginning, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What heavens and what earth are those? The very same ones that scientists study. Now, the differentiation comes because, roughly speaking, science answers the how questions and the why of function. Why is this bit there, not there, and so on. It doesn't deal with the teleological questions. That is the why of purpose. It's dealing with bigger issues. In other words, science can study what you are made of. It cannot answer the much more important question, what you were made for. And therefore, there is a certain separation. And so the speaker is quite right to suggest that the natural sciences are very different in that sense from theology, because their subject matter is different. But we mustn't run away with the fact that because the Bible's primary interest is not in unlocking nature for us, that it is nothing serious to say. It is some very serious things to say. And the most important of them, reading Genesis 1, is, and God said, and God said. And God said, in the beginning was the Word. That is, whenever you have sought out all kinds of mechanisms, our universe is word-based. That is a hugely profound statement to make, especially as it was written thousands of years before the information age. It was written in an age when nobody had any idea that information is a fundamental quantity that is not reducible to matter. And more than that, information is not material. So thank you for that question. Now, is science there to show us how we were made through divinity? Now, I may understand the question incorrectly, but certainly there's an aspect of this that's perfectly true. You see, go back to the Genesis story, which interests me more and more as I get older. I've even written a book about it, but I mustn't advertise books, so I'd forget that. Just think about it for a minute. One of the first tasks that humans were given, according to the biblical record, was to name the animals. That's taxonomy. It's the fundamental intellectual discipline right across the board. All the subjects you're studying, one of the things, especially if you're doing medicine, that can give you many sleepless nights is learning the names of all the bones and arteries and nerves and everything else. You've got to learn a lot of specialized names. Now, the interesting thing about Genesis is God said, you do it. So I hope that encourages you. This is a divine mandate for getting involved in a university at the intellectual level. God says, you do it. I'm not going to do it for you. And therefore, it seems to me, this is a perfectly legitimate and wonderful activity that fills the mind of Galileo and Kepler and Newton and Clerk Maxwell. They found out things by studying nature that we believe, in as far as science represents truth, are true accounts giving us an ever increasingly strong grip on the nature of physical reality. So yes, nature is given to us to explore. And you know, it's interesting, driving through the gold fields today, just thinking about this wonderful story about the garden in Eden, and a river flowed out from it. And if you follow the river, it splits into four, and you find there's gold down there. What is all that talking about? It's talking about human curiosity, which is why many of us are at this university. It was interesting to exploit the mineral wealth down those rivers just as much as it is to do it in Kimberley. You see, God is for the exploration of his world. Now, those are all very positive things. But then the first question is the hardest question of all. It's the really hard question. The problem of evil, pain, whether we recognize it in terms of the natural world, blind, merciless indifference, as Dawkins puts it, the extreme apparent cruelty in nature, and all of that. And we add to that tsunamis, earthquakes, horrific diseases. And then we change gear and we talk about moral evil, the horrors that people do to each other. Do you know, I can understand people that become atheists because of this. I've been in Auschwitz many times, and I've wept every time I've been there. I arrived in New Zealand 3 days after the earthquake and had to change all my talks and television interviews and talk about earthquake why, trying to face this. And I think you'd like me to say something about this, would you? Because it is the hard problem. By far the hardest problem. And I've sat with many people who have said, sorry, you know, this is great talking about the evidence for God in the universe. But listen, the terrorists came and they murdered my daughter. What do you do with that? Or my child was taken by cancer at the age of 4. It's very hard. And I'm going to very briefly, and I hope sensitively, try to give you not an answer, that would insult you, but a way in. The first point is this. Dawkins judges this stuff. And the interesting thing is his base for judgment is thoroughly Christian. It's based on the concepts of goodness and love and so on that are found in the Bible. Now, let me look at it at 2 levels, because you see, in this room even, it's one thing to study pain and evil from the outside. It's another thing to be suffering. Cancer looks very different to a professor of oncology than it looks to the young woman of 23 who's just been told she has 3 months to live. So there's an intellectual question and there's a pastoral question. And we need both at different stages in our lives. So how do we face it? I've been thinking about it all my life, because I find it the hard question. So 1 or 2 points, just very simply. Firstly, let's solve it by getting rid of God. I've often sat with people who, weeping often, have told me of some awful tragedy, either in terms of moral evil or natural pain. And I've just sat and said to them, all right then, there is no God. And they look at me very strangely and they say, but you still believe in God? Yes, I said, I do, but you can see the difficulty I've got. But if you want me to pursue it, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, let me very gently ask you, what you have gained by getting rid of God and what you've lost. Well, you've gained an apparent intellectual solution. How could there be a God of mercy and love who allows this kind of thing in the universe? You've gained a solution to that. That's perfectly clear. But you've lost all hope. Because not believing in God and not having any concept of God, you have, by definition, absolutely no hope that this will ever be sorted out. Now, that might be the correct position, but we need to face it. Secondly, you say you reject God because of this evil. Tell me, where does your concept of evil come from? What are good and evil? If there is no transcendent norm defining them. Now, this is a hugely important discussion that is at the heart of grounding ethics around the world today, and people are floundering for answers. Dostoevsky said once, "Jeśli Boga nie to wsio pozwolę," which means, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. Now, he didn't mean that atheists couldn't do good things. Of course they can. They're made in the image of God from where I sit just as everybody else is. And sometimes will put me to shame. What Dostoevsky meant was there is no base for the concepts of good and evil if there is no God, because our ideas of good and evil become, as we see in Europe today increasingly, purely subjective. Now, here's the problem. Dawkins is saying that it's evil, but he rejects the only, as far as I'm concerned, credible base for believing in good and evil. And he himself rejects it. Listen to this. He said this universe is exactly as we'd expect to find it. If at bottom, and I'm quoting, there is no good, there is no evil, there is no justice, DNA just is that we dance to its music. Well, that's the end of all morality. So you see, there's a contradiction in your quotation and mine. Dawkins claims that there's no such thing as good and evil, and yet he vilifies God because of these things that he says are evil. There's something seriously wrong intellectually going on here, and that needs to be investigated. And because I can't speak all evening, and I'm not going to speak all evening, I suggest that you look at this. That's one side of this. But there's another side. People say to me, how do you keep believing in God? And I say this. Have you ever had an argument as a student that goes on half the night? Surely a good God and a benevolent God and an all-powerful God would, should, could, might, and we go through it for hours and hours. Have you ever done that? I've done it many times. Have you ever come to a satisfactory answer? No. Do you know why that is? Because when we've argued and discussed this question, we're left with the fact that this world presents us with a mixed picture. It presents us with what the question describes, and it presents us with the Andromeda galaxy and the beauty of the animals in Africa and the flowers and the landscape at the sea and the beauty of some human behavior, and it presents us with malevolent evil. I call it beauty and bombs, or beauty and barbed wire. And the reason we get nowhere, ladies and gentlemen, is when it all comes down to it, that is what we are left with. Beauty and barbed wire. So any ideas that don't accept that won't fly. So now let me address that. Because I can't answer those questions. I'm a mathematician, and mathematicians are taught if you can't answer the question you're asked, try and change it to a different question. And often that's highly productive. And it leads you to give an answer to the first question. But what's the different question? Here's my different question. Granted that we're faced with these two sides, beauty and barbed wire. Is there any evidence anywhere that there exists a God that we could trust with it? That's a big ask, isn't it? But you see, this is the heart of why I'm a Christian. And since you've asked me the question, I've got to answer it. At the heart of Christianity, there stands a cross. The claim is, you may not believe it, you may never even have heard it, but at least listen to it before you reject it. The claim is that the person on the cross was God incarnate. And so that raises a very obvious question. What is God doing on a cross? Well, I tell you what it tells me. That God has not remained indifferent to human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's the start. If it had ended there, we'd never have heard about it. But the claims go further, and they claim that the man on the cross was buried and rose again the third day, and that changes everything. Because it means death is not the end. It not only means that, but when the early Christian apostles went around the world, at one stage they ended up in the world's philosophical capital at Athens, and Paul was called upon to explain, possibly in an arena like this. He was called upon to explain to people who had difficulty sorting out the difference between chance and necessity and all the rest of it, what this new strange teaching was. And he said, God has appointed a day in which he is going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed, and has given assurance to all people, not just to Christians, but to all people, by raising him from the dead. Do you see what he's using the resurrection as? It's evidence there's going to be an utterly righteous judgment. That is a magnificent thing, ladies and gentlemen. When people mention judgment, often they don't like it because they feel they might have a rough time, and that is true. But a God of love who doesn't judge is not a God of love. And this world cannot imagine that it can crucify its Creator and hear, and that's the last word they'll ever hear. It is not the last word they'll ever hear. And the tremendous thing is this, that Christianity has something to say in the midst of all this evil. I talked like this in Christchurch in New Zealand. And there was a woman there who'd lost her husband 4 days before. She didn't stay, but she left me a note. And she said, this is the first glimmer of hope I've got. If it's only a glimmer of hope, you see, it raises all kinds of possibilities. If God is like Christ, as Christians claim he is, he's going to sort it out. How he's going to sort that all out, I just don't know. But that brings me back to my question. Are there enough grounds to trust him with it? And all I can say personally, ladies and gentlemen, is I've spent a lifetime thinking of this, over 50 years, because the problem first came to me as a teenager. Here I see the possibilities of a window into a solution. Because Christ offers us personally something that can begin to affect a cure, certainly of the moral disease within inside my own personality. He's prepared to forgive me if I repent and trust him. Now, the question of the apparent brokenness and barbed wire in the natural universe is much more complicated and has to do with the nature of a creation that's gone wrong. I've written a little bit about this in my book, Gunning for God. But I must come to a conclusion here. And it's simply, I have seen again and again people wrestle with this. And the only way I've ever seen them come to any kind of peace is when they came to stand at the foot of the cross and bowed and gave their lives to Jesus Christ.
We're going to take 2 more questions, and then we'll pause to see where we stand with time. In the meantime, I'd like to ask Karnu van Heerden just to prepare. I believe she has a short announcement to make.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Professor Lennox. Just like Cecil John Rhodes, you are an Oxford man and should therefore fully be aware of the complex history Christianity shares with the colonial enterprise. Is it possible to still defend Christianity given that it has been used to further the colonialist end?
I don't know what the question is. Okay. There's another question.
Good evening,
coming.
Professor. Professor, we see many companies, international corporations, pretending to have moral values and pretending to act in the on the best behalf of the society. And then we see almost weekly billion-dollar scandals of these companies lying to us, taking our money, and in some other way being fraudulent. Would it be fair to say that large corporations do in fact not have the same moral values as they pretend to have, but that they rather have a Darwinian worldview wherein they see themselves as more fitting to survive as they in fact see their clients? Thank you.
Okay.
Karnu, are you close by?
Is that it?
Let me just say, ladies and gentlemen, you are such a wonderful audience. We really thank you. Please stay there for a moment. We understand some of you might be writing exams or so. But if you have to leave, I think that's about it. Let's just take the last few questions and then we'll adjourn.
Sure. Thank you, Prof. Here we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Karnu van Heerden, and I am the president of Ratio Christi Potchefstroom. I just firstly want to thank Professor Lennox for coming, and we really appreciate you taking your time to come visit us and share with us. I just have a quick announcement to make. This is an awesome discussion. It is an important discussion. And we at Ratio Christi, we have these discussions all the time. But, not just focused on science, but focused on whatever you can think of. No topic is too controversial. So if you have taken any interest in this conversation, whether you are a Christian or not, I encourage you afterwards. We have a Ratio Christi table here. And there's a sign-up sheet if you want to be more interested in Ratio Christi and the meetings that we have. But there's also information regarding follow-up events that will take place in the coming weeks after this lecture, because we want to keep this discussion going. And it's very important. And we're going to discuss some very important and essential stuff. So I please encourage you to come maak 'n draai. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Karnu. Thank you. Professor, over to you.
Well, we've had 2 more questions. And I'm sure there are people here much better qualified to answer the first one than me. Colonialism and Christianity. I said that our world presents a mixed picture. It also presents a mixed picture politically. And if you look at the history of Christianity, there's a parallel history, so to speak. There's the genuine, and then there's the history of Christendom, which often had a strong political dimension and confused everything by thinking that the way to spread the Christian message was by violence and force. And so you get this horrific mixed picture that on the one hand, you had missionaries coming with medical aid, teaching people to read and write, bringing education, bringing care, and bringing the love of God. But then you had others who still under the aegis of professed Christianity started to exploit people. And we know that history all too well. And it's quite obvious that Christianity and other religions have been guilty of this kind of thing. I'm no expert on it, but you see, I come from a country where Christianity has, in many people's minds, become synonymous with violence and terrorism. And so I face that question. And my answer to it is, when people say, what do you think of it? How do you remain a Christian and come from a country like that? My own family was bombed. Why? Because my father insisted on employing people equally from both sides of the religious divide. So I know exactly where this is coming from. What do I think of it? I'm utterly ashamed of it. Utterly ashamed of it. Utterly ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with a petrol bomb or an AK-47. And why I'm ashamed of it is because Christ himself repudiated violence. Now let me say something that may sound very provocative. Anyone who takes up a weapon to defend Christ or his message is clearly not Christian. Because Christ said, put up your sword. Do you remember that? And Pilate, who was a very shrewd politician and scared stiff of violence around Passover time in Jerusalem, was appalled when this popular preacher was accused of what? Terrorism. Did you realize Jesus was accused of fomenting terrorism? But he was. And Pilate listened to him very acutely. Are you a king? Are you a political threat to Rome? Well, I am a king, but not in the way you think of it. To this end I was born. To this end I came into the world, that I might bear witness to the truth. What is truth? Said Pilate. And he went out. And he was shrewd, you see. He realized something that I hope you realize. The one thing you cannot do with violence is to impose truth. And Pilate said, I find him innocent. And he caved in to those that wanted Christ crucified. I used to wonder why there is so much in the Gospels about the trial of Christ. I think this is the answer, because we need it in the 21st century to answer the question, what is Christian? The final point on this is that you remember what Peter did. He wasn't a very good swordsman, and somehow they found two swords. And when the party came to arrest Christ, he took the sword and he cut a young man's ear off. Do you remember that? That actually happened, I believe, and Christ put the ear back on. But you'd be very dull if you didn't realize that he was preaching a massively important sermon. And it's this. If you take weapons to defend Christ or his message, you will cut the ears off people in a big way. That's why the world doesn't listen to the Christian message. They've had their ears cut off by violence in the name of professed Christianity. So I'm going to suggest to you that our Christians tonight, I'm going to give you a new job. It is the job of ear repairer. I put it that way so you remember it. Because the important thing is, and let me speak to you, the Christians, that you listen to people that have difficulty with the Christian faith, and you find out what has cut their ears off. That is the purpose of an organization like Ratio Christi and RZIM. It's exactly to help people that can't hear. Dawkins can't hear the Christian message. Hitchens couldn't. Their ears had been cut off by all these awful things that had happened. And now about the big corporations, that they pretend to have moral values, and then we find they cheat, they take our money, and so on. Is it not Darwinism? Yes, it is, very often. The survival of the fittest, the strong against the weak. How do we deal with it? Well, I mix a lot with corporate people who have very high-powered jobs of leadership, and they all know that it's one thing to have an ethical mission statement on your boardroom wall. It's another thing to get it into the hearts of your managers and directors. Now, we can see that, and we writhe because ordinary people who are not empowered just get washed away in the tide of corruption. Corruption, ladies and gentlemen, is by far the biggest drain on the financial resources in the world. By far. How do we deal with it? It starts with me, that we learn not to be corrupt. And if you see this as a problem, and it's a problem, and get the chance, because you've studied here and you get a good degree, to give people work, then you can build these principles into your work so that at least in your little company, there will be evidence that it's really possible to run a ship without resorting to corruption, bribery, cheating, and all the rest of it. It begins with me. The trouble is, we find it easy to talk about huge problems that we feel that we personally can do nothing about, but we can do something about them. We can become less corrupt than we are, less liable to cheat than we are. And we can all cut corners. And this is one of the wonderful things about the Christian faith, that we don't have to do it on our own. God can come in and through Christ give us the power to reverse this kind of thing. And it can be very difficult indeed. So that's that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have to say again that you are a wonderful audience. Thank you very much for this evening. We are almost done. I pledge to not overstep the 9 o'clock limit, and if so, by only a few minutes, but hopefully not. So we have an opportunity for questions from the floor. We promised that we would do that. Dr. Mambil and helpers, are you ready with a few questions? Could you please assist us? I think one or two more questions. There you go. This would be the two last questions, and then a small formality. We'd like to thank Professor Lennox a bit more tangibly, and after that we'll adjourn.
Good evening. I will be presenting two questions asked by the audience that we received via Twitter and SMS and so forth. So, Professor Lennox, the first question that we received from the audience was, how does one know between the multitude of gods which God is the true God? Is there not more reason to believe in an indifferent creator, such as believed by Jefferson and Mendeleev? That is the first question.
Okay.
The second question that we received, or that we are asking tonight, is if God is good and all-powerful, where did Satan's first evil thought come from when he rebelled against God? Thank you.
Okay. How many hours have you got? Let's take the second one first, because what the question introduces, quite rightly so, is that anybody that reads the biblical record will realize that the problem of evil is immensely sophisticated, because it didn't originate on planet Earth, if we take the record seriously. And what we have to wrestle with here, and it's not easy, is the concept that when humanity started, there was already an alien being in the universe. The details and the information are very limited. Now, people, when they read these stories, they poo-poo them. And yet, they tell me, the scientists, that there's life on billions of planets, and everybody believes them. But the moment the Bible suggests that there's some kind of alien life, no, that can't be true. Now, that's inconsistent and illogical thinking, and I take it seriously. Why? Because the problem is obviously greater than human. There's a fracture. And what the Bible says, and we'd need a lot of time to unpack it, even up to the best of my knowledge, which isn't much. C.S. Lewis is perhaps the writer that tried best to wrestle with this in his science fiction novels like Voyage to Venus. The idea that God created beings at a higher level than humans, but that nevertheless had freedom of will and were able to rebel. Now, I can understand that in one sense, because the analysis of the nature of the imago Dei, the image of God in man that's given in Genesis, gives us insight into that. Because according to the biblical account, the man and the woman were in a garden and they could eat everything except one thing that was forbidden. And God said, in the day you eat of that, you shall surely die. Now, those are the basic ingredients of morality. Everything they could eat except one thing. And the one thing forbidden by the Word of God immediately tells us a whole series of things. First of all, they could eat. There's no point in forbidding something if you're surrounded by an electric fence. They were able to eat it. But God said, you mustn't eat it. And therefore, the moral relationship that was set up had to do with whether or not they would obey God. That's vastly important if you're studying ethics. Because the origin of human ethics was not human. It was in a relationship, a word relationship between God and the humans that he had created. That has huge implications. And we know what happened. They were tempted by the evil one who said, has God really said? And he attacked the word of God. And that's where the major attack still comes. Particularly for Christians who believe the word of God. Has God really said? Now, if that's true, on the human level, we can think backwards, at least to the possibility of it happening at a higher level. And that is what the Bible claims. But it doesn't give us enough information. And as you probably know, speculation is inversely proportional to the amount of actual information we've got. And I could speculate, but I'm not going to because I simply do not know. Now, the final question, I've completely forgotten. It was... Have you forgotten it too?
Hello.
It was about the multiplicity of gods. Which God? Well, I know only one way of deciding it. On the basis of evidence. You see, Christianity, few other religions, but mainly Christianity, claims to have a strong historical dimension. And for that reason, it is checkable. It's checkable in several senses. Objectively checkable in the sense that we can evaluate using the methods of historical science, the reliability of the documents, the way they cog into secular history, and all of that kind of thing. And you see, we can test the claims. Now, I have friends in all of the three major monotheistic religions. My Jewish friends tell me, to focus the question, that Jesus died but didn't rise. My Muslim friends tell me that he didn't die and I believe he died and rose. Those three things cannot be simultaneously correct. And the only way to decide it, as far as I know, is to assess the evidence and come to your own conclusion. And it's very important that we do precisely that. So there's that kind of objective kind of looking at history, looking at the evidence. The evidence for the authenticity of the New Testament is vastly more than the evidence for the Latin textbooks that I read at school and accepted as authentic without question. And so on and so forth. We can get at, say, the claim that Christ rose from the dead by looking at all the alternatives. If he didn't die, how did the tomb come to be empty? Well, perhaps the disciples mistook it, but how could they have mistaken it since a guard was around it and it was a known tomb? And so you can examine it forensically. I've done it hundreds of times. Why? Because I want to know, ladies and gentlemen. But finally, people often say to me, you know, you're a scientist, and in science things are testable. How could you be a Christian? It isn't testable. Oh, yes, it is. You see, let me come to the subjective side. I mentioned it earlier. Jesus Christ claims that if I repent, that is, change my mind and agree with God's analysis of the mess I make of my life and other people's lives, and face that and say, God, I want to turn from that. And if I do that and trust Christ as the one who gave his life for me on that cross and took the judgment that I deserve on himself, then things happen. Firstly, Christ promises to give me forgiveness. As you think of your life, is forgiveness a question for you? He promises to give me peace with God. Very many of the leading people I meet around the world, if not all of them, when I ask them, how do you feel about things? I'm uncertain. I've no peace. I'm restless. Christ can give you peace. He can give you new power if you're fighting all kinds of temptations and addictions and habits that you despise yourself for, and change your life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've lived for a long time, as you see. I'm 75. And again, I have seen people whose lives are, they tell me, in a mess. And then I meet them 6 months later and they're totally changed. The alcohol that drowned their relationships has been replaced by food on the table. The marriage that was going on the rocks, or the relationship that was going astray, has been repaired. There's peace, there's harmony, there's purpose. And I say, what has happened to you? And they'll say something like, well, you know, I became a Christian. Or I met Christ. Or I received Christ. They may say it in very different ways. But when you see that not once, not twice, but dozens and dozens of times, you begin to see that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know where you are, you can decide that tonight. That is, if you've understood enough of what I've said to take that step for the first time in your life and trust Christ. If you want to know more, there are people around from Ratio Christi and RZIM and so on in this festival of thought to talk to you about these things, because these are the big things in life. And they can transform your university experience. Do you know, one of the most important things, and with this story I stop, coming from the sort of Freudian questioning that I did in Ireland, coming to Cambridge, one of the big things that presented itself to me, is it really possible to change your worldview? Peter Singer challenged me with that in a debate in Australia. And he said, the trouble is that I told the audience about my parents being Christian. He said, well, you're a typical example. People stay in the faith in which they've been brought up. So when I got the chance to speak, I said, Peter, you didn't tell us about your parents. Perhaps you should. Were they atheists? And he said, yes, they were. I said, oh, so you stayed in the faith in which you were brought up? Oh, but he said, it isn't the faith. Oh, I said, that's curious. I had the impression you believed it. That is very surprising for a world-class philosopher. Not to realize that his atheism is part of a belief system. You've all got a belief system. The question is, can it be changed? And I remember when I first engaged with a student at Cambridge who didn't share my background, who didn't go to church, who was agnostic about things, and I talked to him for 2 years until one day in the mass lecture I saw he wasn't listening. And I said, what's happened to you? He said, last night in my room, I bowed down. I came to see that Jesus was the Son of God, and I'd become a Christian. That was a huge turning point for me. That was the start. And I've seen it so many times since. You see, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that Christianity is not just helpful. It's not just a religion. It's a personal relationship that is solidly based on intellectually valid, rigorous truth. And therefore, it is internationally open to everyone. Good night, and thank you very much for listening.